Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Recently in my Beginner Rapier class, we've been putting a heavier focus on measure. What it is, the types of attacks we can do, and the basic actions and responses in each measure. And while going through these drills and options, I noticed some folks were taking very big advances and were in fact skipping some measures altogether, and not even realizing it. This meant that actions that normally would work were becoming much more difficult. And this is a really common issue, especially with new fencers. So many of us take really big advancing steps, much bigger than we actually need. This is especially true of shorter fencers as well, who know they need to cross that danger zone before they can get into their own offensive measure against a taller opponent. But the thing is, taking big steps creates for large tempos, and large tempos means a greater opportunity for our opponents to strike us in. The difference between one measure to the next is often pretty small, so taking big steps has diminishing returns quickly and can often put us too close to the fight to fight efficiently. Because of this, we came up with a fun little way of visualizing our offensive measure, so we have some tangible data to work with along with our fencing theory. And in this video, we're going to go over the measure visualization exercise we did in class, first doing it with a partner, and then adapting it as a solo training exercise you can do at home. Okay, before we dive into the exercise, let's make sure we're all working off the same definitions here, at least for the sake of this video. Measure describes the distance between one's weapon and its target. Specifically in this exercise, we're looking at our offensive measure, which we define by the distance from our back foot. At Boston Academy d'Armes, we work off the following terms for our measures, which is rooted in the Academie duello system, so it is a mix of historical and ahistorical fencing terms. Larghissima, or widest measure. This is the distance one can cover and strike using a passing lunge. Larga, or wide measure. This is the distance one can cover and strike using a step lunge. Stretta, or narrow measure. This is the distance one can cover and strike using a leaning lunge. Strettissima, or narrowest measure. This is the distance one can cover and strike with the mere extension of the arm and body. These are the measures we use at Boston Academy d'Armes and we'll be using for this video, but you can follow the teachings for whatever system or master you prefer. Okay, so the actual exercise itself is pretty simple. You just need yourself, a training partner, a sword, and something to use as visual markers. We use beanbags. Start off by marking a spot where you'll line your back foot at. Next, have the student take their normal on guard stance, aligning their back foot with this first marker. Now the student will extend their sword arm and hinge forward into their forward guard. The coach or the student's training partner then approaches until the tip of the student's sword is touching the partner's chest. The partner drops a beanbag at their feet to mark misura strettissima. Next, the student does the same but with a leaning lunge. Again, the training partner carefully approaches and marks the distance with a bag. This is misura stretta. Do this for misura larga by having the student perform their step lunge. And then lastly, have them perform a passing lunge for their final measure, misura larghissima. Again, we did these 4 measures as it aligns with our teachings at Boston Academy d'Armes, but you can use the same ideas for any fencing system or master you're studying. After illustrating Oneshka's measure, we swapped roles and did the same thing for me, going through each attack type to mark each type of measure. As you can see, despite being roughly the same height, our measures vary pretty greatly. My narrow measure are almost equal to Oneshka's wider measures, and we'll quickly go over how stance and mobility plays a role in our measures at the end of this video. If you do this in your class with several people, you'll get some very different looking measures, which creates for some interesting dialogue and exploration of the concept of measure and distance. Okay, if you don't have a training partner or just want to do this as a home exercise, we can still do the same thing, but we're going to do it in a bit reverse. Instead of marking where our sword tip extends to, we'll measure where the back foot is after striking a target. Start off by setting up a stationary target. This can be anything you don't mind thrusting at. I use my target pad against a wall. Next, get into your on guard stance. Extend your sword arm and hinge forward into your forward guard. Make any small adjustments to your stance, either forward or backwards, until you strike the target. This can be done with or without a bend in the blade, but you want to make sure that you're consistent throughout the exercise. Drop a beam back at your back foot. This is your strettissima. Take a step back and do the same for your leaning lunge, again making any adjustments in your footwork as you need. Mark your back foot with another marker. This is your stretta. Do the same for your step lunge to illustrate misura larga, and then your passing lunge to find misura larghissima. And voila, you now have a visual representation of your offensive measures. Alright, some things to keep in mind when looking at your markers. First, the width of a fencer's stance is going to change a few things. If the fencer has a wider stance such as my own, you're probably going to see a uniform distance between strettissima and stretta and between stretta and larga. Depending on the width of the stance and the fencer's mobility and athleticism, you're also likely to see a smaller gap between stretta and larga since the front foot can only travel so far from where it already is. Again, because of the location of our back foot. If a fencer has a narrower stance, like a neshka, you'll probably see a more uniform distance between the various measures, or possibly a smaller variation between strettissima and stretta compared to the rest. Personal athleticism and mobility also plays a factor here. For example, one of my students, Laura, has a very narrow stance and a small step lunge, so the difference between her strettissima, stretta, and larga are all very minimal. However, she's very comfortable attacking on the pass, and therefore has a huge differential between her larga and larghissima. In fact, despite her limited step lunge distance, she's able to cover the same amount of distance with her passing lunge as other fencers in the class. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of this, though there are definitely benefits for increased hip mobility and athletic ability. However, it's more important for fencers just to know exactly what their measures are and how range changes depending on their stance and the attack footwork they choose. And that's it. I hope you found this little video interesting and informative. You can find more training videos on my YouTube channel and blog posts on my website, justinswordfit.com. And if you're in the Boston area, be sure to check out my brand new fencing school, Boston Academie of Arms. We also offer weekly online classes if you want to drop in and join us. Links to all that, plus my social media, will be in the description below.